Good evening. In Minas Gerais, amidst the mountain ranges that hold centuries of history and small towns seemingly frozen in time, legends circulate. Some are fairy tales, others stories of courage and faith. But there are those that resonate with a different tone, an echo of ancient fear. What I am about to tell you today is one such account, the chronicle of a terror that for decades was relegated to folklore, but which, for the inhabitants of a forgotten village, was a palpable reality, the truth behind the legend of the monster of Minas Gerais. Prepare yourselves, for not every monster story is merely a bedtime tale. The first whispers and the ancient lore, 1980s. The village of Dry Stone, nestled in a remote valley, was, in the 1980s, a sanctuary of peace. Life there was a slow current of foggy dawns and golden dusks, governed by the cycles of farming and the calm rhythm of livestock. The nights, long and silent, were illuminated by a vast, starry sky that seemed to embrace the solitude of the mountains. It was in this setting that the first signs of the inexplicable began to manifest. Initially, small domestic animals, chickens, ducks, sheep, appeared dead on rural properties. But this was not the work of common predators. The carcasses were peculiarly dismembered, with injuries that did not fit the pattern of bites or scratches from jaguars or wild dogs. There was something more brutal, more methodical, almost a mockery in the way life was taken. Whispers began in the general stores and around the wood-burning stoves. The elders, with wisdom etched onto their skin by sun and time, recalled an ancient legend, a tale their own grandmothers had whispered on stormy nights. The legend of the Mine Guardian, or as some preferred to call it, the Stone Beast. It was said that the mountain surrounding Pedra Seca held veins of gold and precious crystals deep within its bowels, and that an ancient creature, a being of stone and earth, was its protector. The legend warned that anyone who profaned the land or coveted its treasures would awaken the Guardian's wrath. The younger generation, like Farmer Marcos, then in his early 20s, laughed at these superstitions. "It's just a boulder jaguar," he would say, while the elders shook their heads, a glint of apprehension in their eyes. The disbelief, however, began to crumble. In 1987, the attacks escalated. Larger livestock, horses and oxen, began to disappear or were found dead with horrific injuries. Immense claw marks that seemed to have torn flesh and bone with terrifying ease. One night, Marcos's family swore they heard a roar that made the house's very foundation vibrate, a sound that belonged to no known animal, emanating from the dense forest bordering the property. Apprehension transformed into fear. The streets of Pedra Seca became deserted at dusk, and windows closed earlier. The silence of the night, once comforting, now seemed filled with an invisible lurking presence. Stories of the monster were told in hushed tones, and with each new attack, the legend grew more real. The escalation of terror and silence testimonies. 1990s. The 1990s brought with them a dark turn. The monster of Minas Gerais was no longer content with animals. In 1993, a young local hunter, known for his audacity and for disregarding the elders' warnings about not entering the forest on full moon nights, disappeared without a trace. His hunting dogs returned to the village days later, terrified, with severe injuries and howling incessantly. His remains were found a week later. The community was in shock. Encounters with the creature became closer, but without a clear sighting. People felt an oppressive presence, a cold and malevolent energy, terrifying sounds, guttural growls, heavy scuffling on the ground, a putrid smell of decaying flesh, were reported by those who dared to leave their homes. A woman, Donna Clarice, swore she saw an immense shadow at her kitchen window, with glowing red eyes, watching her for seconds before retreating into the darkness. She fainted from terror and spent weeks in a feverish state, murmuring disjointed words about embers for eyes and moving shadows. Attacks on isolated houses became more audacious. Solid wooden doors were broken open as if they were paper, windows shattered, and interiors ransacked in an inexplicable fury. State authorities, called to investigate, arrived in the village with an air of superiority, but found nothing but destruction and deeply ingrained fear. They attributed the incidents to criminals or wild animals, but the people of Drystone, united by terror, knew the truth. They felt abandoned, alone against a threat that no outsider seemed willing to acknowledge. The authorities' disbelief only heightened the residents' sense of powerlessness. The community united in fear, forming nightly vigils and improvised protection rituals, passed down by the elders, using herbs, prayers, and amulets. Full moon nights were especially dreaded, and the village transformed into a silent refuge, with houses lit by candles and lanterns, and the sound of rosaries prayed in low voices echoing through the corridors. The search for truth and the shocking revelation. 2000s. It was in this climate of fear and resignation that Daniel, grandson of Marcos, the farmer from the first part of the story, decided to return to Drystone in 2005. Daniel was a young university student with a curious mind and a fascination for folklore. He had grown up hearing stories of the monster, but saw them as quaint tales. However, the melancholy in his grandfather, who always avoided talking about the subject, intrigued him. Daniel began to investigate. He talked to the residents, listened to the whispers, and perceived the gravity of their fear. It was in his grandfather's old house, among dusty papers, that he found the key piece, an ancient diary, handwritten by his great-great-grandfather, one of the original gold prospectors who explored the mountains mines in the 1800s. The diary revealed a dark and shocking truth. It was not merely a protective creature. Greedy prospectors found cursed gold. To control the mountain and its treasures, they performed a profane ritual, evoked from an ancient book found in the mine itself. They made a pact with an ancestral entity, which promised fortune in exchange for a terrible price. The price was the transformation of one of them into a cursed guardian, a hybrid being linked to the mountain, whose function was to protect its treasures and, ironically, to punish those who disrespected the pact or the land. The creature was not just a monster. It was the result of unbridled ambition, a being of suffering and vengeance, bound to an infernal destiny. The diary detailed the disappearances of prospectors who tried to break the pact or who simply became expendable to the entity. The attacks in Drystone were not random. They were the creature claiming what was due to it, or punishing the constant invasion of its territory by those attempting to exploit what was its own. Daniel located the mine described in the diary, a specific and isolated area, with peculiar-looking rocks, marked by strange symbols his great-great-grandfather had drawn. With the help of one of the more skeptical local guides, he managed to reach the site. There, among the rocks, Daniel found vestiges of the rituals, and the sense of malevolence was palpable. It was then that Daniel, in the depths of the mine, had his own encounter. A growl echoed from the shadows, and an immense figure with incandescent red eyes emerged from the darkness. It was not an animal. It was a creature of grotesque proportions, with disproportionate limbs and skin that looked like rock and flesh at the same time. There was something human in its gaze, an ancient pain mixed with fury. It was the monster of Minas Gerais. Daniel had no time to react. The monster let out a deafening roar and charged. Daniel, terrified, managed to roll to the side and escape through a narrow crack in the rock. He ran like never before, feeling the creature's hot breath on his neck, the echo of its growl pursuing him through the dark tunnels of the mine. He managed to get out, but the sight of that being, the truth behind its existence, marked him forever. The legacy of an unbelievable truth. Daniel attempted to disseminate his discovery. He presented the diary, the photos of the symbols in the mine, his testimony. But, as expected, he was discredited. The academic community viewed him as an impressionable young man, and the authorities as someone trying to fabricate stories for attention. The diary was dismissed as fantasy, and the markings attributed to natural rock formations. The monster of Minas Gerais remains a legend to the outside world, a folklore tale for tourists and superficial researchers. But for the residents of Dry Stone, it is a cold and terrifying reality. They know the truth. The creature still roams the mountains, guarding its secrets, reminding everyone of the price of greed and the consequences of meddling with forces that defy reason. The legend of the monster of Minas Gerais is not about a mythical being. It is about the cost of human ambition and what happens when man desecrates the sacred. The truth behind the legend is far darker than any werewolf tale, for it reveals that the greatest monster can be human nature itself. And on some nights, when the full moon bathes the Minas Gerais mountains, the residents of Dry Stone still hear the distant growls, a reminder that the cursed guardian is always watching. Good night.